My name is Cassidy Miller. I am 32 years old, and for more than a decade I was the ghost at my own family's table, a cautionary tale of unrealized potential that my mother used to sharpen her tongue. You were always a small-town girl with small-town brains. New York would have chewed you up and spat you out before the first midterms. These were the words my mother, Eleanor Miller, whispered into her chilled glass of $85 Veuve Clicquot at my sister's wedding last June, the condensation from the flute dripping onto her silk Oscar de la Renta gown like slow, expensive tears. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She was too busy watching my younger sister, Bianca, spin across the dance floor of the Pierre Hotel in a custom Vera Wang that cost more than my first 3 years of rent in a studio apartment in Scranton. I stood there, clutching a cheap clutch bag from a clearance rack at TJ Maxx, feeling the familiar sting of being the disappointment, the one who stayed behind in our suffocatingly quiet Pennsylvania town while the rest of the world moved on. For 14 years, I believed I was a failure because of a letter from Columbia University that never arrived, a letter that I thought contained a rejection but had actually been the match that lit my family's web of lies on fire. To understand the weight of that moment at the wedding, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Miller household. We lived in a sprawling 4-bedroom craftsman on the good side of Oliphant, Pennsylvania, where the lawns were manicured to a precise 2-inch height and the silence was heavy with things unsaid. My father, Robert Miller, was a senior partner at a mid-sized accounting firm, a man who measured love in tax brackets and depreciating assets. My mother was the social architect, a woman who treated our family reputation like a delicate Ming vase she was constantly terrified I would drop. Then there was Bianca. Bianca was 3 years younger, a whirlwind of blonde hair and effortless charisma who never met a test she couldn't ace or a person she couldn't charm. In my mother's eyes, I was merely the plain, sturdy background music to Bianca's solo performance. The year was 2010, and I was a high school senior with a 4.2 GPA and a hunger for New York City that felt like a physical ache in my chest. I had spent months on my application to Columbia University, pouring my soul into an essay about escaping the limitations of small-town expectations. I remember the smell of the old library books where I studied until 10 o'clock every night, the way the cold Pennsylvania air bit at my face as I walked home, dreaming of the lights of Morningside Heights. When the day for the admission decisions arrived, the mailbox remained empty for me, while Bianca, then a freshman, watched with a smirk as I checked the porch 3 times an hour. A week later, a thick envelope arrived for a girl down the street, but for me, there was nothing. My mother sat me down at the heavy oak dining table, a plate of dry roast chicken between us, and told me that sometimes ordinary people have to accept ordinary lives. She convinced me that I hadn't even been waitlisted, that I was simply not Ivy League material. Broken and humiliated, I stayed. I enrolled in the local community college, then a state school, while Bianca eventually glided into NYU with a full ride and a wardrobe of designer coats my parents happily financed. I became a dental hygienist, working 40 hours a week at Miller & Associates, no relation, cleaning the teeth of the very people I had grown up with, while my parents sent me clippings of Bianca's socialite life in Manhattan. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, the narrative was the same. Cassidy was the reliable one who stayed close to home because she couldn't handle the big pond, while Bianca was the star. But let me take you back to that wedding at the Pierre Hotel, where the air smelled of lilies and excessive wealth. The reception was a blur of 5-course meals and a 12-piece band that played jazz standards with clinical precision. My mother was in her element, holding court with her New York friends, bragging about Bianca's new position at a top-tier marketing firm. I had slipped away to the mezzanine to catch my breath, the weight of 14 years of inadequacy pressing down on my lungs. I found myself near a small, ornate desk where the wedding coordinator had left some overflow gift bags and a stack of old family photos my mother had brought for a memory lane display that never made it to the main floor. As I flicked through the photos, my fingers brushed against an old, yellowed envelope tucked into the back of a silver frame. It was addressed to me. The return address was Columbia University, Office of Undergraduate Admissions. The postmark was dated April 2010. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the frame. I pulled the letter out. It had been opened long ago, the top jaggedly torn. Dear Ms. Miller, it is with great pleasure that I inform you of your admission to the Columbia University class of 2014. The words blurred as my eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. I wasn't just accepted. I had been offered a prestigious dean's scholarship that would have covered nearly 80% of my tuition. I stood there in the shadows of the mezzanine, the muffled sound of the electric slide playing downstairs, and realized that my entire adult life had been a lie constructed by the woman currently downstairs drinking champagne. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. Not yet. I walked back down the grand staircase, the plush carpet deadening my footsteps. I found my mother near the bar, her face flushed with the success of the evening. She saw me approaching and put on that tight, pitying smile she reserved for me. Cassidy, dear, you look a bit peaked. Maybe you should head back to your hotel. The city air is always a bit much for you. I held the letter up, the yellowed paper clashing against the shimmering gold wallpaper of the ballroom. Her eyes dropped to the Columbia logo. The color drained from her face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass, her knuckles turning as white as the pearls around her neck. I found this, Mom, I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the ambient noise of clinking silverware and laughter. It was in the back of the photo frame, the one you said you lost years ago. She didn't deny it. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive grapes and cold calculations. We did it for your own good, Cassidy. You were so settled here. Bianca needed the spotlight. She needed that environment to thrive. You would have just been another face in the crowd, and you would have left us all alone in that house. You were the only one who stayed. We needed someone to stay. The sheer, breathtaking selfishness of her words felt like a physical blow. They had sacrificed my dreams, my career, and my self-worth just so they wouldn't have an empty nest, and so that Bianca wouldn't have to compete with her older sister in the one arena where I actually excelled. They had let me spend 14 years thinking I was small-town brains, so they could keep me as a convenient local daughter to run their errands and attend their boring Sunday dinners. I looked at my father, who was standing a few feet away, nursing a scotch. He saw the letter in my hand and turned his head away, unable to meet my eyes. He had known too. The reliable accountant had helped balance the books of my stolen life. I spent 14 years thinking I wasn't good enough, I whispered, the rage finally beginning to simmer beneath the surface. I spent my 20s feeling like a failure every time I looked at a map of New York. I let you treat me like a servant because I thought I owed you for my own mediocrity. You have a good life, Cassidy, my mother snapped, her voice regaining its sharpness. You have a steady job, a car, a roof over your head. Don't be dramatic. It was a long time ago. What does it matter now? It matters because I'm 32, not 80, I said. I took her glass of Veuve Clicquot from her hand, the glass that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and poured it slowly onto the expensive floral arrangement at her elbow. The liquid soaked into the white hydrangeas, turning them a sickly yellow. It matters because today is the last day you ever get to tell me who I am. I turned and walked out of the Pierre Hotel, the cool night air of Fifth Avenue hitting my face like a benediction. I didn't take the train back to Pennsylvania. I walked toward Central Park, my heels clicking on the pavement, the city lights finally looking like home instead of a taunt. I had no plan, no luggage, and a bank account that was modest at best. But for the first time in 14 years, the small-town girl realized that the only thing small about her life had been the people who raised her. Family isn't the people who share your blood while they bleed you dry of your dreams. Family is supposed to be the wind at your back, not the cage that keeps you from flying. As I watched the yellow cab streak past, I knew that the bill for 14 years of lies was finally coming due, and I wasn't going to be the one paying it. For over a decade, I lived in the shadow of a hollow what if, a ghost of a life that was stolen from me before it even had a chance to begin. And it is only now, with the weight of that yellowed Columbia acceptance letter in my hand, that I can see the sheer, calculated scale of the theft. While my younger sister, Brianna, moved through her teenage years like a pampered sovereign, her path to success paved by my parents with a $450 an hour private SAT tutor who specialized in Ivy League entrance strategies and a customized $1,200 college application consultant who spent weeks polishing her personal statements, I was existing in a completely different reality. I spent those same pivotal years working 28 hours a week at Miller's Deli on the corner of Main and Elm, a grease-stained local haunt where the air always smelled of sliced pastrami and floor cleaner, earning a measly $7.25 an hour, plus meager tips that usually consisted of loose nickels and sticky quarters left behind by construction workers. My parents, Robert and Susan Miller, played a cruel game of financial optical illusions, constantly claiming that the family coffers were bone dry whenever my needs arose, yet miraculously finding the funds to ensure Brianna never felt a moment of lack or competition. I vividly remember standing in our tiled kitchen, the linoleum peeling at the corners, asking for a $20 fee for an extracurricular debate club, only to be told by my father, without him even looking up from his accounting ledger, that things were too tight this month, and that I needed to be more realistic about our station in life. Meanwhile, Brianna would walk into the room wearing a fresh pair of $160 Nike Jordans that my mother had bought her just because it was a Tuesday, the crisp white leather of the sneakers a stinging contrast to the hand-me-down Payless shoes I wore, which had soles so thin I could feel the temperature of the pavement through the rubber. The disparity wasn't just in the luxury items, it was in the very foundation of our futures, as my parents systematically dismantled my confidence to build a pedestal for their golden child. When it came time for college, they sat me down and looked me in the eye with a rehearsed gravity, explaining that they simply couldn't afford my dreams of New York or a top-tier university, citing the rising costs of property taxes on our 4-bedroom home and the unforeseen expenses of maintaining their own lifestyle. I believed them because daughters are taught to trust the people who feed them, so I settled for the local community college, a gray brick institution 3 miles away that felt more like a 13th grade than a gateway to the world. To get there, I drove a battered 2004 Honda Civic in a faded, peeling silver, a car that had clocked over 185,000 miles and hummed with a permanent, unsettling vibration in the steering column. It had a leaking radiator that was a constant source of anxiety, requiring a $400 repair every 3 months just to keep the engine from smoking on the highway, a sum that represented nearly 2 weeks of my deli shifts. I remember the bitter cold of Pennsylvania winters, sitting in the driver's seat of that Honda, waiting for the defroster to kick in while I stared at Brianna's brand new black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked in the driveway, its heated leather seats and pristine finish a testament to the fact that money was never the problem. I was the problem. My mother, Susan, would spend her afternoons at the local country club, sipping iced tea and complaining to her friends about how difficult it was to manage Brianna's busy social and academic schedule, all while I was scrubbing dried mustard off the deli counters or rushing to a night class on introductory sociology. They made me feel like my labor was a requirement for my existence, while Brianna's leisure was a birthright, and they used the fact that I was local as a weapon to keep me under their thumb, turning me into a glorified personal assistant. I was the one who picked up the dry cleaning, the one who made sure the groceries were stocked, and the one who sat through their endless, droning stories about Brianna's sparkle and potential, all while I nursed the secret, crushing disappointment of a life I thought I wasn't smart enough to have. They let me believe that my failure to get into Columbia was a reflection of my small-town brains, a phrase my mother loved to use like a blunt instrument, implying that I lacked the intellectual grit to survive in a city like New York. I would lie awake in my small bedroom, the one with the drafty window that my father refused to weather strip, listening to the radiator clank and hiss, wondering why I was so fundamentally lacking in the qualities that made Brianna worthy of investment. I didn't realize then that they weren't investing in her talent. They were investing in a narrative that required me to be the foil, the drab, hard-working, unsuccessful older sister who would always be there to make the star look brighter and to take care of the parents when they grew old. Every time my radiator blew or my Payless sneakers took on water during a rainy shift at the deli, I felt a sense of personal shame, as if my inability to thrive on $7.25 an hour was a moral failing rather than a systemic abandonment by my own flesh and blood. My father would occasionally, generously offer to pay for half of a car repair, but it always came with a lecture about fiscal responsibility and how I needed to work harder if I wanted the things Brianna had, completely ignoring the fact that he had gifted her the Tahoe for her 18th birthday without a single condition. The psychological toll of this constant gaslighting was immense. I began to view my own ambitions as delusions and my desire for a better life as a form of ingratitude toward the parents who provided me with a roof and a leaking Honda. I became an expert at shrinking myself, at silencing the part of me that wanted to study literature or law, and instead focused on the tactile, repetitive reality of dental hygiene, a practical, safe career that my mother approved of because it meant I would never earn enough to truly leave or outshine the family's expectations for me. I can still taste the salt of my own tears as I drove to my final exams at the community college, the Honda's engine temp needle creeping toward the red zone, while I listened to a voicemail from my mother reminding me to pick up Brianna's favorite organic kale and artisanal cheeses for her welcome home party after her first semester at NYU. The sheer hypocrisy of their poverty when it came to my education versus their abundance when it came to Brianna's whims is a wound that never truly scabbed over, even after I transitioned into my career as a hygienist. I remember one specific Thanksgiving where my father stood up and gave a toast to Brianna's unparalleled drive and her upcoming internship at a prestigious Manhattan firm, an internship that my parents had secured through a family connection and a significant donation to a charity gala. As he spoke, I caught my mother's gaze. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and boredom, her hand resting on a designer handbag that cost more than my entire year of community college tuition. I realized in that moment that they didn't see me as a person with goals or a future. They saw me as a piece of furniture, something that belonged in the Oliphant House and should be grateful it wasn't out on the curb. They calculated that by denying me the resources to leave, they were ensuring their own comfort, effectively sabotaging my life to protect the peace of their domestic arrangement. Now, standing here with the proof of their betrayal in my hand, a letter that proves I was never small-town brains, that I was actually an Ivy League-bound student with a scholarship, the memories of those 3-month radiator repairs and the greasy deli shifts feel like a violent assault on my younger self. I was never a failure. I was a victim of a 2-person conspiracy to keep me small, and as I look at the black Chevrolet Tahoe still sitting in their driveway, I realized that the radiator in my life wasn't the only thing that was broken beyond repair. My relationship with the people who raised me is currently overheating, and this time, no amount of money or careful explanations will ever be able to fix the damage they intentionally caused. The betrayal did not come with a scream or a dramatic crash, but rather arrived at exactly 9:42 p.m. during the height of Brianna's wedding reception at the Oakwood Estate, a venue where the rental fee alone exceeded $40,000 for a single evening of manufactured perfection. The air in the ballroom was thick with the cloying scent of 500 white lilies and the expensive humidity of 300 bodies dancing under bohemian crystal chandeliers that hummed with a low electric frequency. I was sitting at table 12, positioned strategically near the kitchen doors, where the draft from the industrial refrigerators chilled my shoulders, while my sister sat on a literal dais, draped in lace that cost more than my entire 4-year degree. My Aunt Sarah, who had been steadily working her way through at least 4 high-end gin and tonics from the open bar, leaned toward me until I could smell the sharp, botanical tang of the alcohol on her breath and the powdery scent of her Chanel No. 5. She placed a heavy, ring-cluttered hand on my forearm and slurred with a jagged, drunken pity that felt like a serrated knife against my skin, saying that it was such a shame about that NYU letter all those years ago, but that my mother was ultimately right to toss it because I simply wasn't ready for a city that big. The air left my lungs as if I had been physically struck in the solar plexus. The ambient noise of the 12-piece swing band and the clinking of gold-rimmed silverware receding into a high-pitched, ringing vacuum that left me staring at her smeared lipstick in stunned silence. My mother, Eleanor, who was seated directly across from me, did not even flinch at the revelation. She didn't drop her gaze or fumble with her silk napkin, but instead reached up with a practiced, elegant motion to adjust the bodice of her $3,500 Swarovski-encrusted gown, which caught the light like 1,000 tiny, cold stars. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her vintage Krug champagne and looked at me with a terrifyingly calm expression that lacked even a flicker of remorse, her eyes as hard and unyielding as the diamonds in her earlobes. Between the arrival of the lobster thermidor and the scheduled commencement of the champagne toasts, she admitted the truth with the same casual tone one might use to discuss a change in the weather, confirming that she had indeed intercepted my acceptance letter 14 years ago. She described with a chilling lack of empathy how she had pulled the thick ivory envelope from the mailbox before I got home from my shift at the deli, how she had walked it to the backyard fire pit near the stone patio, and how she had watched the embossed crest of the university curl and blacken into ash. I sat there, frozen in my chair, as she explained that she had watched me cry for months, watched me slip into a deep, quiet depression as I mourned the future I thought I was too stupid to earn, all while she comforted me with lies about small-town brains and realistic expectations. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking, a calculated emotional assassination performed by the person who was supposed to be my primary protector. And the silence that fell over the table was not one of shock, but of heavy, complicit guilt. I looked around at the faces of my father, my cousins, and my family friends, and I saw the way they all suddenly became intensely interested in their gold-plated dessert spoons or the patterns on the damask tablecloth. It became agonizingly clear that this was not a secret kept by one person, but a conspiracy of silence that the entire Miller inner circle had participated in for over a decade. They had all known that I was the girl who got in, the girl who had been offered a way out, and they had all stood by and watched me struggle to pay for a leaking 2004 Honda Civic, while Brianna was gifted a life built on the foundations of my stolen ambition. The realization that my pain had been a source of domestic convenience for them made the bile rise in my throat, especially as my mother continued to justify her actions by saying that I was the glue that held the family together, and that New York would have only changed me into someone they wouldn't recognize. She spoke about my life as if it were a resource she had the right to manage, an asset she had decided to liquidate for the sake of the family's proximity and her own comfort during her aging years. I looked at the lobster on my plate, a decadent dish that probably cost more than the radiator repair I had agonized over just 3 months ago, and I felt a profound sense of revulsion for every piece of furniture in that estate, every flower and every smiling face in the room. No one defended me. Not my father, who had balanced the books and knew exactly where the money for my missing tuition had been redirected, and not Brianna, who was currently laughing at the head table, her veil trailing on the floor like a white flag of my surrender. I stood up, the legs of my chair screeching against the polished marble floor with a sound like a dying animal, a sound that finally cut through the festive atmosphere and drew the eyes of the surrounding tables. My mother looked up, a flash of annoyance crossing her face as if I were being difficult or dramatic on her golden daughter's big night, her hand instinctively reaching for the pearls at her neck. I didn't say a word to her, because there were no words in the English language that could bridge the chasm of 14 years of systemic betrayal, but I felt the weight of my own worth finally beginning to settle in my bones like a heavy, solid stone. I realized then that my small-town brains were an invention of her insecurity, a cage she had built out of stolen mail and backyard ash to keep me from realizing that I was the strongest person in the room. The hyper-realistic details of the room became sharp and jagged, the way the condensation was sliding down the silver ice bucket, the precise shade of the blush bridesmaids' dresses, the sound of the wedding coordinator's headset crackling nearby. And I knew that I was recording this moment as the final entry in the book of Cassidy Miller, The Disappointment. I walked away from that table, past the silent relatives who couldn't look me in the eye, and out through the massive mahogany doors of the Oakwood estate, leaving behind the lobster, the Swarovski crystals, and the family that had treated my life like a sacrifice to be burned. As I walked into the cool, dark night of the parking lot, the sound of the band fading into the distance, I wasn't the broken girl who failed to get into college anymore. I was a woman who had just discovered that her greatest enemy had been her own mother, and that the only thing standing between me and the life I deserved was the false history I had been told. Family isn't the people who share your DNA while they burn your future in a fire pit to keep themselves warm. Family is supposed to be the light that guides you home, not the hand that puts out the fire in your soul. I reached into my bag for my keys, my hands finally stopping their shaking, knowing that tomorrow morning, the 2004 Honda Civic was going to drive as far away from Oliphant as the leaking radiator would allow, and I wasn't going to stop until the smell of the backyard ash was completely gone from my lungs. I sat in my battered 2004 Honda Civic, the interior smelling of stale coffee and the faint metallic scent of the leaking radiator, as the digital clock on the dashboard flickered to exactly 11:15 p.m. The parking lot of the Oakwood estate was nearly empty now, illuminated only by the harsh orange glow of a single sodium vapor street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt and reflected off the hood of my car where the clear coat had long ago peeled away. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a single plain white paper napkin, the kind they handed out in stacks at Miller's Deli, and I laid it flat across the steering wheel, smoothing the creases with a trembling hand that eventually went cold and steady. With a black ballpoint pen I found in the center console, I drew a thick, jagged line down the center of the napkin to create two distinct columns, labeling the left side 14 years of lies and the right side total cost of my stolen future. On the left, I began to list the psychological weights I had carried since 2010, the whispered insults about my small-town brains, the fabricated rejections from universities I had actually gotten into, and the way my mother had used my manufactured failure as a leash to keep me anchored to her side. On the right, I began to calculate the literal financial devastation of their betrayal, starting with the $80,000 Dean's Scholarship from Columbia that had been tossed into a fire pit and the hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential income I had lost by spending my 20s as a dental hygienist instead of the corporate lawyer or literature professor I was meant to become. As the ink bled slightly into the cheap fiber of the napkin, I realized with a clarity that felt like a bucket of ice water over my head that I didn't need their love or their approval anymore because you simply cannot deposit love into a bank account to pay for a life. I looked at the shimmering lights of the estate in the rearview mirror, knowing that my parents were likely still inside, toasted by expensive wine and secure in the belief that they had successfully managed me into a corner for another decade. What they didn't know, what my father the accountant had failed to track, was that I had been building a fortress in the silence of my supposed mediocrity for the last 5 years. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, logging into a high-yield savings account that was registered to a P.O. box they had never seen and linked to an email address they didn't know existed. The screen glowed in the dark cabin of the Honda, displaying a balance of $14,500, money I had painstakingly hoarded by working double shifts, taking on every holiday opening at the dental office, and selling vintage clothes on the side while letting them believe I was barely scraping by. It was my escape hatch fund, a mountain of cash built from the crumbs they had left me, and seeing that number made the remaining embers of my grief finally extinguish into a cold, hard resolve. I also pulled a thick manila folder from beneath the passenger seat, a folder that was stuffed not just with the yellowed Columbia letter, but with what I called my digital ghosts. These were printed screenshots of bank transfers my father had made to Brianna over the years, records of donations to NYU that coincided exactly with the months they told me we were too broke to fix my car, and a series of emails I had recovered from an old family computer 3 years ago that I hadn't fully understood until tonight. Those emails were between my mother and a local admissions consultant, discussing how to redirect my mail to ensure I wouldn't be tempted by out-of-state offers that might take me away from my duties at home. I sat there in the silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, muffled bass of the wedding band playing a final song, and I decided right then that there would be no more tears, no more pleading for a seat at their table, and no more searching for a mother's warmth in a woman who was a hollow shell of Swarovski crystals and cruelty. The transaction of my life had been one-sided for 14 years, with me giving my youth, my labor, and my self-esteem to pay for a debt I never actually owed. But the balance was about to shift in a way that would leave the Miller household bankrupt in every sense of the word. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the way the orange light hit the bruise-like shadows under my eyes, and I saw a woman who was done being a daughter and was ready to become a creditor. Every hour I spent scrubbing floors for my mother's luncheons, every dollar I spent on a radiator that wouldn't have been an issue if I had been allowed to take my scholarship, and every minute of therapy I would eventually need to process this betrayal was now a line item on a bill I intended to collect. I folded the napkin carefully, placing it inside the folder with the digital ghosts, and I felt a strange, electric thrill at the thought of the cold, hard transactions that were about to replace our family holidays. I shifted the Honda into gear, the transmission clunking with its usual protest, and I didn't look back at the Oakwood estate as I pulled out of the parking lot, the red glow of my taillights the only part of me they would ever see again. I spent the next 3 hours driving aimlessly through the back roads of Pennsylvania, the headlights cutting through the fog that rolled off the Lackawanna River, and with every mile the plan became more concrete, more surgical, and more detached from the emotional wreckage. I thought about the 2004 Honda Civic, which was a rolling monument to my parents' neglect, and I decided that the first transaction would be its replacement, not with something flashy that would tip them off, but with something reliable and invisible, like a used but well-maintained Toyota that wouldn't leave me stranded while I dismantled their world. I thought about my apartment, the one my mother called quaint, but was actually a cramped one-bedroom above a dry cleaner, and I realized it was the perfect base of operations because they never bothered to visit, meaning I could pack my life into boxes without them ever noticing the void I was leaving behind. The financial reality of the situation was that they had stolen roughly $300,000 of my future when you accounted for the scholarship, the interest on the loans I wouldn't have needed, and the wage gap between a hygienist and an Ivy League graduate. But money was only the beginning of the total cost I had written on that napkin. The true cost was the 14 years of self-loathing they had injected into my veins like a slow-acting poison, making me believe that I was lucky to even have the scraps they threw me. As I pulled into my apartment complex, the clock now showing 2:30 a.m., I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were looking at the Miller family through a telescope from a very great distance. They were no longer my parents. They were simply two people who had committed a high-stakes fraud against a minor, and I was the investigator who had finally found the smoking gun. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, my heels clicking on the metal grating, and as I unlocked the door, the smell of my own life, lavender laundry detergent and cheap vanilla candles, met me, reminding me that I had built this small, meager existence entirely on my own. I sat down at my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the darkened room, and I opened a new spreadsheet, titled it Miller Liquidation, and began to transfer the data from the napkin into a digital format that would survive any attempt they made to gaslight me again. I spent the rest of the night mapping out their assets, their social standing, and the specific vulnerabilities of my father's accounting firm, knowing that the small-town brains they had mocked were about to execute a strategy that New York itself would have admired for its ruthlessness. Family isn't a biological tie that grants you the right to harvest someone else's potential. Family is a contract of mutual protection, and since they had breached that contract in the most spectacular fashion possible, I was now declaring the entire relationship null and void. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a gray, filtered light through my window, I had stopped being Cassidy Miller, the disappointment, and had become something far more dangerous to a family built on appearances. I had become the person who was going to make them pay the full retail price for every lie they had ever told. On Monday morning at precisely 8:00 a.m., the city was still shaking off a gray, drizzling rain that coated the glass skyscrapers of the financial district in a slick, oily sheen. But I was already standing in the lobby of the Thorne building, clutching my manila folder to my chest like a shield. I had an appointment with Marcus Thorne, a forensic accountant whose reputation for dismantling fraudulent estates was as sharp and intimidating as the charcoal pinstripe suits he wore, and as the elevator rose to the 42nd floor, I could feel the cold weight of the evidence against my family pulling at my joints. When the doors opened, I was greeted by an office that smelled intensely of expensive, hand-rubbed mahogany, aged leather, and the bitter, invigorating aroma of $15 a cup artisanal espresso being pulled from a chrome machine that looked more like a piece of laboratory equipment than a kitchen appliance. Marcus Thorne himself was a man of precise movements and calculating eyes, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries as he gestured for me to sit in a chair that cost more than my first year of community college tuition. His desk a vast, polished expanse of dark wood that reflected the overcast sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I placed the manila folder on the desk between us, the paper slightly dampened by the morning mist, and I watched his gloved hands. He wore thin, white cotton gloves to handle original documents, begin to leaf through the 14 years of calculated neglect and financial redirection I had documented. As my father's part-time bookkeeper for the last 3 years, a role he gave me because he thought I was too small town to understand the complexities of his ledgers, I had been quietly monitoring the business accounts he thought were invisible to me. I had sat in my cramped apartment at night, cross-referencing entries, tracking wire transfers that didn't make sense, and noting the subtle discrepancies in the operational expenses that always seemed to peak right when Brianna had a new designer bag or a spring break trip to Tulum. Marcus Thorne's eyes moved with the speed of a high-speed scanner, his brow furrowing as he pulled out a specific set of spreadsheets I had highlighted in yellow. And for 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the occasional clink of his espresso cup against its saucer. Then he found it. The smoking gun that transformed my family's tight budget into a criminal enterprise of emotional and financial sabotage. Spread across 3 years of ostensibly lean business cycles were a series of consulting fees totaling $82,400, all paid out in systematic increments to a merchant account that was directly linked to my sister Brianna's platinum credit card debt. While my parents had sat me down in that drafty kitchen and looked me in the eye to tell me they were broke and couldn't afford to help me with my $400 radiator repairs or my tuition, they were funneling nearly $100,000 into Brianna's shopping habits and luxury lifestyle. Every time I had skipped a meal to save for my secret account, every time I had worn my thin Payless shoes through a snowstorm, my father had been clicking confirm on a transfer that ensured his golden daughter never had to face the consequences of her own extravagance. The sheer mathematical proof of their betrayal was a physical weight in the room, a number that sat on the mahogany desk like a pile of stolen jewels. And for a moment, I felt the old Cassidy, the girl who wanted to be loved, trying to gasp for air, but the new Cassidy, the creditor, simply leaned forward and tightened her grip on her phone. I didn't stop with the bank statements. I reached into my bag and pulled out my iPhone 15 Pro, its titanium frame cold against my palm, and I opened the voice memo app to a file labeled Wedding Admission. I pressed play, and the silent, mahogany-scented office was suddenly filled with the ambient roar of Brianna's wedding reception, the muffled jazz band, the clinking of Swarovski-encrusted crystal, and then my mother's voice, clear as a bell and twice as sharp. The recording captured every syllable of her confession, the interception of my Columbia letter, the backyard fire pit where my future was turned to ash, and the chilling justification that I was too useful at home to be allowed to succeed in New York. Marcus Thorne listened with a stillness that was almost predatory, his eyes fixed on the waveform moving across the screen of my phone. And when the recording ended with the sound of my chair screeching against the marble floor, he slowly leaned back and let out a long, controlled breath. He told me, in a voice that was professionally detached but carried a hint of genuine shock, that what I had wasn't just a family dispute. It was a documented case of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially mail theft, given that I was 18 when the letter was intercepted. The forensic analysis continued for another hour, with Thorne identifying an additional $60,000 in educational gifts to Brianna that had been masked as charitable donations to avoid gift taxes, all while my father was claiming a hardship deduction on his own filings. We were looking at a total of nearly $150,000 in direct financial redirection, not even counting the lost value of the dean's scholarship or the career earnings I had been denied by being forced into a lower-tier profession. I sat there, drinking the bitter espresso that Thorne's assistant had brought me, and I felt a sense of icy triumph beginning to replace the hollow ache in my chest because the small-town brains they had mocked had just built a cage made of their own greed. I realized that my father's accounting firm, the source of their prestige and the engine of their wealth, was built on a foundation of these very ledgers, and that exposing the consulting fees would not just hurt his reputation, it would likely trigger a full-scale audit that would bring the entire Miller empire crashing down around their ears. Marcus Thorne looked at me over the top of his silver-rimmed glasses and asked me what I wanted to do next, his pen hovering over a retainer agreement that would officially make him my weapon of choice. I thought about the 14 years of lies, the 2004 Honda Civic, the way my mother looked in her Oscar de la Renta gown while she told me I wasn't good enough, and the way no one at that wedding table had stood up for me. I realized that love was a word people like the Millers used to negotiate a better price for your soul, but restitution was a word they actually understood, and I was going to make sure they learned the definition of every single letter. I signed the agreement with a steady hand, the ink black and permanent on the heavy cream paper, and I felt the final tether to my childhood snap with a satisfying, silent crack. As I left the office and walked back out into the rain, the city didn't feel like it was chewing me up or spitting me out. It felt like it was finally recognizing me as one of its own, someone who knew the value of $1 and the precise cost of a lie. I headed toward a nearby dealership, the folder of digital ghosts tucked under my arm, knowing that the next time I saw my parents, I wouldn't be arriving in a silver Honda with a leaking radiator. I was moving into the phase of cold, hard transactions now, and the first item on the invoice was my freedom, followed closely by the interest they owed me for every tear I had shed over a rejection letter that never actually existed. The world looked different through the lens of forensic accounting. It was no longer a place of mystery or fate, but a ledger that had been out of balance for far too long, and I was the only one who could make the numbers match the truth. Family is a bond that is supposed to be priceless, but my parents had put a very specific price tag on mine, $82,400 in credit card debt, and I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, they would realize they had made the worst investment of their lives. I walked toward the subway, the sound of my heels on the pavement echoing with a new metallic confidence as the plan for the Miller liquidation moved from a spreadsheet into the devastating reality of a legal landslide that was already beginning to move. Exactly 14 days after my meeting with Marcus Thorne, the sun rose over Oliphant, Pennsylvania, casting a deceptive golden warmth across the sprawling back lawn of the Miller estate, where the bi-monthly family Sunday brunch was already in full swing. The weather was a statistically perfect 72 degrees Fahrenheit with a light breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks. But as I pulled my newly leased, pristine midnight blue Toyota Camry into the overflow parking area near the edge of the property, I felt a cold, clinical detachment that no amount of spring sunshine could thaw. This wasn't just another social obligation. This was the day the ledger would finally be balanced, and I had prepared for it with the precision of a general. I was dressed in a charcoal gray Hugo Boss power suit that had cost me exactly $642, including tax, a significant investment that served as my modern-day armor, its sharp tailoring and structured shoulders providing a physical barrier between me and the family that had spent decades trying to keep me small. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, noting the way the dark fabric made my eyes look hard and obsidian, and I reached for the heavy box on the passenger seat containing 45 meticulously organized, color-coded packets, each one bound in a professional navy blue sliding bar cover. As I walked toward the white marquee tent where 42 of our relatives and the local social elite were gathered, the sounds of clinking silverware and practiced laughter grew louder, underscored by the smell of a $2,100 catering spread that included smoked salmon from Maine, artisanal quiches, and a carving station with prime rib. My mother, Eleanor, was positioned at the center of the largest table, her laughter ringing out like a series of small glass shatterings as she held court, her hand resting on the sleeve of a guest as she boasted loudly about Brianna's newest acquisition, a $1.2 million luxury condo in Chicago's Gold Coast. She was describing the floor-to-ceiling windows and the custom Italian cabinetry with a fervor that made it clear this was her latest trophy, a physical manifestation of the success she had cultivated by sacrificing my future at the altar of Brianna's comfort. I didn't wait to be invited in, nor did I look for a seat among the cousins who usually ignored me. Instead, I marched directly to the head of the tent, the rhythmic click of my heels on the flagstone patio cutting through the ambient noise until several people turned to look, their conversations faltering at the sight of my uncharacteristic transformation. I didn't sit down, and I didn't accept the glass of mimosa that a confused server tried to offer me. I simply stepped onto the slightly raised stone hearth of the outdoor fireplace and cleared my throat, a sound that wasn't loud but carried a frequency of such absolute authority that the atmosphere inside the tent turned sub-zero in an instant. The 42 guests, including my father Robert, who was mid-sip of a Bloody Mary, and Aunt Sarah, who looked uncomfortably sober for once, all froze as I held up the stack of 45 packets, the white paper gleaming under the high noon sun like a stack of legal summons. My mother's smile didn't just fade, it curdled, her eyes darting to the charcoal gray suit and then to the packets as she realized with a visible tremor that the reliable daughter had finally stopped following the script. I began to speak, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had plagued me for 14 years, and I started by handing the first packet to the person nearest to me, instructing them to pass them down the tables until every single person in the room held a copy of the Miller liquidation report. The packets were a masterpiece of forensic clarity, color-coded to ensure that even the most disinterested relative could understand the scale of the fraud. Green pages for the $82,400 in consulting fees that paid off Brianna's secret debts, red pages for the intercepted Columbia University scholarship letter, and blue pages for the documented bank transfers that proved my parents had been lying about our financial status since 2010. As the guests began to flip through the pages, the silence in the tent became so heavy, it felt as though the oxygen were being sucked out of the space, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an impending disaster. I watched my father's face turn a sickly shade of gray as he reached the section detailing his own business account discrepancies, his hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled against the mahogany table. My mother tried to stand, her $3,500 Swarovski-encrusted earrings swinging frantically, and she opened her mouth to launch into a practiced defense of family privacy and Cassidy's overactive imagination, but I simply held up my iPhone 15 Pro and pressed play on the external speaker I had tucked into my suit pocket. The recording of her confession from the wedding echoed through the marquee, her own voice admitting to burning my acceptance letter and watching me cry for months because I was too useful to lose to New York, and it acted like a physical blow to everyone listening. The guests who had just been celebrating Brianna's $1 million condo were now staring at a line-item audit of the theft that had paid for it, and the social capital my mother had spent a lifetime building evaporated in the time it took for the recording to reach its conclusion. I didn't look for sympathy, and I didn't wait for an apology that I knew would be as hollow as the last 14 years. I simply stood there, a 32-year-old woman in a $600 suit, and watched as the people who had treated me like a burden realized that the small-town brains they had mocked had just executed a surgical strike on their entire reality. The catering bill for the brunch was $2,100, but the cost of the packets in their hands was going to be much higher, involving legal fees, a total loss of community standing, and a forensic audit of my father's firm that Marcus Thorne was already preparing to hand over to the state authorities the following morning. I noticed my sister Brianna in the back, her face pale and her designer sunglasses pushed up onto her head, looking at the spreadsheet that detailed exactly how many of her consulting fees had been stolen from my scholarship fund, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for her. No envy, no anger, just a cold, clinical observation of a person whose lifestyle was built on a foundation of stolen time. My mother finally found her voice, screeching that I was destroying the family over a mistake from a decade ago, but I just looked her in the eye and told her that I wasn't destroying the family, I was simply performing a long overdue audit and that the Miller family was currently in a state of moral and financial bankruptcy. I told the room that they could finish their smoked salmon and their expensive quiche, but that as of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my father's accounting firm would be under investigation, and that I had already moved my belongings out of the apartment they looked down upon and into a life where their opinions carried exactly zero weight. The sheer hyper-realism of the moment was etched into my mind, the way a drop of condensation from a water carafe fell onto page 12 of my aunt's packet, the precise way the sunlight caught the confidential stamp on the forensic report, and the sound of my father's heavy breathing as he realized his career was effectively over. I walked off the hearth and toward the exit of the tent, my charcoal gray suit unwrinkled and my head held higher than it had been since that day in April 2010 when the mail went missing. I didn't need to stay for the fallout because I knew that the packets would do the work for me, circulating through the town's gossip mills and professional circles until there wasn't a single person in Oliphant who didn't know the truth about the Golden Millers and the daughter they had tried to bury. As I reached my car, the interior still smelling of the new car scent that represented my first true independent purchase, I looked back at the white marquee one last time and saw 42 people staring at the blue packets as if they were holding unexploded grenades. Family is not a license to commit fraud against your own children, and it is certainly not a bond that requires the sacrifice of one person's soul to fuel another's vanity. It is supposed to be a sanctuary, and when the sanctuary becomes a prison, you have every right to burn the blueprints and walk away with the keys. I shifted the Camry into drive, the engine purring with a smooth, silent efficiency that was a world away from the rattling protest of the old Honda, and I drove away from the 72-degree day and the $2,100 brunch without a single backward glance. The bill for 14 years of stolen potential had finally been served, and as I merged onto the highway toward a city that didn't care about my small-town brains, I knew that the transaction was finally complete. The weight that had been on my chest for over a decade wasn't just gone. It had been transferred to the people who deserved to carry it, and for the first time in my life, the numbers on my personal ledger finally added up to a future that belonged entirely to me. Since we are sharing family secrets and celebrating new beginnings like million-dollar condos in Chicago, I said, my voice maintaining a surgically steady volume of exactly 65 decibels that cut through the humid afternoon air like a frozen blade, let us talk about the true market price of a decade-long lie. I moved with a slow, deliberate grace, handing out the navy blue packets I had prepared, the heavy cardstock covers feeling solid and authoritative in my hands as I distributed them to the cousins, the uncles, and the influential family friends who had spent the last hour nodding along to my mother's polished exaggerations. Page 1 of the packet was not a letter of grievance but a cold, hard legal reality. A notarized affidavit from Mr. Henderson, the local postman who had serviced our route for 30 years, detailing how my mother had met him at the end of the driveway every afternoon in April 2010 to personally intercept any correspondence from Columbia University before I could see it. The sound of 40 individual silver forks hitting the expensive ceramic plates at once created a discordant, metallic symphony, the most beautiful music I had ever heard in the Miller household, because it was the sound of the narrative finally shattering. My mother's face, which had been flushed with the triumph of her social standing just moments ago, underwent a terrifying transformation, draining of all color until it reached a sickly, translucent shade of gray that made the Swarovski crystals at her throat look like glittering ice on a corpse. I watched as the guests turned to page 2, where the atmosphere under the $2,100 marquee tent shifted from polite confusion to a stunned, airless vacuum. This page contained a meticulously formatted spreadsheet, a forensic accounting of the $112,000 in family funds that had been diverted to Brianna's credit cards, European vacations, and luxury wardrobe over the last decade. It was a line-item indictment of their hypocrisy, showing that while I was pulling double shifts at the dental office and eating ramen in a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner to pay my way through night school, my father was clicking confirm on wire transfers that ensured Brianna never had to feel the weight of a single financial responsibility. My father, Robert, tried to stand, his face a mottled purple as he gripped the edge of the linen-covered table so hard the veins in his forearms bulged, his mouth opening to launch into one of his practiced booming lectures about respect and the sanctity of the family home. I didn't let him start. I simply held up a single finger, a gesture of such absolute icy control that he actually recoiled, his voice dying in his throat as he looked around at his peers who were now staring at him, not with admiration, but with the quiet, horrified fascination people reserve for a multi-car pileup. "I am not finished," I said, my voice remaining at that terrifying 65-decibel constant, and I gestured for them to turn to the final section of the packet, which I had titled, "The Invoice for 14 Years of Stolen Potential." This wasn't just a list of grievances. It was a professional valuation of the life they had intentionally sabotaged to keep me as their local, reliable servant, including the lost compound interest on the $80,000 scholarship they burned and the $300,000 wage gap between a state school dental hygienist and a Columbia-educated professional. I detailed the cost of every radiator repair on that 2004 Honda Civic, every night I spent crying because I thought I was small-town brains, and every missed opportunity that was sacrificed so that my mother could have a daughter to run her errands and my father could have a daughter to balance his hidden ledgers. The hyper-realism of the scene was overwhelming, the way the smell of the prime rib now seemed cloying and rotten, the precise way a bead of sweat rolled down my father's temple and landed on the spreadsheet, and the way Brianna's custom Vera Wang lace seemed to wilt under the collective gaze of the room. I looked at my mother, whose hand was shaking so violently she had to set her champagne flute down on the table, the vintage Krug spilling slightly and soaking into the white damask like a spreading golden wound. She tried to whimper that they did it because they loved me, because they couldn't bear to see me fail in a city like New York, but I looked through her as if she were made of glass, realizing that her love was nothing more than a predatory need for control dressed up in designer silk. I explained to the 42 guests that this brunch was not a celebration of Brianna's new life, but a final closing of the books for mine, and that the small-town girl they had all pitied was actually the only person in the room with a clean balance sheet. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, mocking chirp of a robin in the oak trees, and I felt a sense of profound, crystalline peace as I realized that the cage door had been open the entire time. I just had to wait for the moment when my captors were too busy bragging to notice I had stolen the keys to their empire. Every single packet I handed out represented a piece of the armor I had built since that 9:42 p.m. revelation at the wedding. A shield forged from $14,500 in secret savings and a folder full of digital ghosts that were now very, very real. I didn't care about the scandal that would erupt in Oliphant by dinner time, nor did I care about the inevitable legal battle that Marcus Thorne was currently preparing to launch against my father's accounting firm. What I cared about was the fact that for the first time in 14 years, I was breathing air that wasn't thick with the smoke of my own burned dreams, and the charcoal gray boss suit felt like the only skin I had ever truly owned. I watched as my Aunt Sarah, usually the loudest person in any room, slowly closed her packet and looked at my parents with a mixture of disgust and genuine fear, a reaction that told me the social death of Robert and Eleanor Miller was already underway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key to the 2004 Honda Civic, the car that had been the symbol of my suppression and my father's calculated poverty, and I dropped it onto the table in front of him, the metal clinking sharply against his gold-rimmed plate. I told him he could keep the leaking radiator and the 185,000 miles of my life that he had stolen, because I had already signed the lease for a future that he would never be allowed to audit. I turned my back on the $2,100 catering spread and the 42 silent judges, walking away from the marquee tent and the 72-degree day with a stride that was long and unburdened. I could hear my mother finally start to wail behind me, a high, thin sound that lacked any real grief and was instead the sound of a woman realizing her audience had finally walked out on her performance. As I walked toward my midnight blue Toyota, the sun felt hot on the back of my neck, but the core of my being was a solid block of ice that would never melt for them again, because you can't repair a relationship that was built on the intentional destruction of your soul. I looked at the Miller estate in the rearview mirror as I started the engine, the white tent looking small and insignificant against the vastness of the Pennsylvania sky, and I realized that the total cost I had written on that napkin in the dark parking lot was finally being paid in full. Family isn't the people who share your blood while they bleed you dry of your ambitions. Family is a covenant of truth, and since they had chosen to live in a house of lies, I was more than happy to be the one who finally set it on fire with the truth. I drove out of the gates for the last time, the invoice for 14 years of my life tucked firmly into my memory as a settled debt, and as I headed toward the state line, I realized that the small-town brains they had laughed at were the very thing that had finally made me free. The transaction was over. The audit was complete, and for the first time in 32 years, Cassidy Miller was no longer an asset to be managed, but a woman who was finally, undeniably, the master of her own account. I cut them off that very day, walking away from the manicured lawns and the suffocating expectations of Oliphant without a single glance at the rearview mirror of my midnight blue Toyota. The separation was surgical and absolute, a total blackout of the life I had known for 32 years as I moved my few remaining belongings into a 1,200-square-foot industrial loft in the heart of the city, a space with exposed brick, soaring 10-foot windows, and a silence that felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. I sat on the polished concrete floor of my new home on that first night and methodically blocked 18 phone numbers, including those of my parents, Brianna, Aunt Sarah, and every cousin who had sat silently at that brunch while my future was being auctioned off. The digital silence was immediate and profound, a cessation of the constant, buzzing anxiety that had occupied the back of my skull since 2010. And as I watched the city lights flicker to life through my new windows, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was the only person with a key to my identity. The fallout from the Miller liquidation report was swift and devastating, proving that the truth is a far more effective weapon than any amount of inherited wealth or social standing. Within 3 weeks of my presentation at the Sunday brunch, my father's accounting firm, Miller and Associates, lost its single largest corporate client, a regional manufacturing conglomerate that accounted for nearly 40% of his annual revenue. What my father didn't know was that the board of directors for that conglomerate had received a copy of the forensic audit I had compiled with Marcus Thorne, and they were not interested in having their finances managed by a man whose personal ledgers were built on a foundation of familial fraud and diverted funds. My new firm, a rising powerhouse in the financial sector where I had recently accepted a high-level administrative role while pursuing my advanced degree, was the one that picked up the contract, completing a perfect circle of professional and personal poetic justice. The loss of that client was the first domino in a series of financial collapses for Robert Miller, as the state licensing board began its own inquiry into his bookkeeping practices, triggered by the evidence of those $82,400 in consulting fees that were actually disguised gifts to his favorite daughter. Brianna's downfall was perhaps the most visible, a public crumbling of a life that had been funded by my stolen potential and my mother's relentless ambition. Without the consistent, underground allowance that my father had been funneling into her accounts to cover the mortgage and the astronomical association fees on her $1.2 million Chicago condo, the glass and steel dream began to shatter. She was forced to put the property on the market within 90 days, selling it at a significant loss in a cooling real estate climate, and the images she posted on social media of her minimalist new start in a cramped rental in a less than glamorous neighborhood were a hollow attempt to mask the reality of her bankruptcy. My mother, Eleanor, found herself socially isolated in Oliphant. The woman who once held court at the Pierre Hotel, now finding that her invitations were no longer being returned and her seat at the country club was perpetually empty. The Swarovski-encrusted gowns and the Oscar de la Renta silks remained in her closet, relics of a reputation that had been burned in the same fire pit where she once tossed my Columbia acceptance letter. In the midst of their collapse, I was finally, truly living for myself, building a life on a foundation of merit rather than manipulation. I enrolled in a prestigious executive MBA program, and for the first time, the small-town brains they had mocked were allowed to run at full capacity, resulting in a perfect 4.0 GPA that felt like a series of small, golden victories for the 18-year-old girl who once thought she wasn't good enough for New York. I spend my mornings in high-level strategy meetings where my input is valued not because I am useful or compliant, but because I am sharp, analytical, and uncompromisingly honest. My loft is filled with the things I love: books with spines that haven't been broken, a high-end espresso machine that reminds me of the morning I met Marcus Thorne, and a workspace where I spend my evenings studying the complexities of global finance. There is no 2004 Honda Civic with a leaking radiator in my life anymore, and there are no Sunday brunches where I have to play the role of the disappointment to make someone else feel like a star. My heart, which had been heavy with an ache I couldn't even name for 14 years, has finally stopped hurting, replaced by a quiet, steady hum of self-reliance that no one can take away from me. I have learned that family isn't a biological obligation to endure abuse, nor is it a blood debt that requires you to set your own dreams on fire to keep someone else warm. Family is a choice you make every day based on mutual respect, transparency, and the courage to see one another as whole, independent human beings. I have built a new circle of people who know my story and value my strength, a family of choice that doesn't require me to shrink myself or hide my successes to maintain a fragile domestic peace. I still have the yellowed Columbia letter, now framed and hanging on the wall of my office, not as a reminder of what I lost, but as a trophy of what I reclaimed from the ashes of my parents' deceit. The total cost of my stolen future turned out to be a price my parents couldn't afford to pay, but the value of my present is something I measure in moments of peace and the absence of fear. I have realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the forensic audit or the lost clients or the sold condo. It was the fact that I survived their attempt to erase me and came out on the other side as a woman who knows her own worth down to the last decimal point. The small-town girl they tried to keep in a cage is now a powerhouse in a city that didn't chew her up or spit her out, but rather welcomed her home like a long-lost daughter who finally remembered her own name. Every night as I lock the door to my loft, I feel the weight of those 18 blocked numbers like a protective shield, a reminder that I have the power to decide who gets access to my energy and my future. My name is Cassidy Miller. I am 32 years old, and I am finally the primary beneficiary of my own life, a life that is no longer for sale at any price. The transition from a victim of a family conspiracy to the architect of my own destiny required me to be more ruthless than I ever thought possible, but it was a ruthlessness born of necessity and the fundamental right to exist as more than a footnote in someone else's biography. I look at my reflection in the dark glass of my windows, and I see a woman who has settled all her debts, closed all her old accounts, and is now operating with a surplus of dignity that no one in Oliphant could ever comprehend. The small-town brains are now managing millions of dollars in assets, and the small-town girl is walking the streets of Manhattan with a stride that suggests she owns every square inch of the pavement she was once told she wasn't smart enough to walk on. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and since no one stayed with me when the fire was burning, I am more than happy to stand alone in the light of the new life I have built. The invoice is paid, the books are balanced, and the story of Cassidy Miller, the disappointment, has officially reached its final, unchangeable conclusion.